In this video, we're going to engage the question, how did people read in the ancient world? And when I talk about the ancient world in this context, I'm talking about the Greco-Roman world, the context of the New Testament. What I say here is not equally applicable to every ancient context. We're dealing with a very specific ancient context here. And how we're going to get at this question of how people read in the ancient world is by debunking two different myths that are especially common in early Christian and New Testament studies about how people read in the ancient world. I'm going to bring the receipts showing you that there were different ways that people read that sort of oppose or go against, run against the grain of these two common myths. So let's go ahead and jump into the first one. The first myth is that people in the ancient world always or usually read aloud. And this myth finds its origins in an account that Augustine narrates about his teacher Ambrose, when he came upon his teacher Ambrose reading silently in a room by himself. And so the logic goes that Augustine was surprised about Ambrose reading silently to himself. And so this ability must have been strange. It must have been unique to Ambrose. But when we examine the situation a little bit more closely, it's clear that Augustine's surprise is not actually about Ambrose's unique abilities, but rather about Ambrose reading to himself in a particular setting. And why we must say that Augustine is not surprised about Ambrose's ability is because Augustine himself had the ability to read silently in a different account, the so-called tolle lege account, the take up and read, where Augustine takes up a passage from Romans and it sort of spurns his conversion. Augustine says that he reads himself silently. And so in the Ambrose account, Ambrose also explicitly reads silently. So this first text, and I'm going to list 10 different texts here that are accounts of people reading silently to show us that people did in fact read silently in antiquity, that reading was not always or usually allowed in this context. So in two different places, Augustine speaks of reading silently. He does it and his teacher Ambrose does it. The next text here is from Athenaeus. He reproduces a riddle that is reportedly from the poet Sappho, and this riddle implies that letters are by their very nature silent, so when someone is reading an epistle and someone else is standing by, they won't know what's in the epistle because those letters are silent. Our third text here is actually a set of texts on the stage. So in tragedies and comedies, the playwrights, there are characters who read to themselves. They'll come upon some kind of text or document, and they'll be reading the document. The audience and the other characters won't know what's going on. They won't know what's in that document until that character sort of reveals what is in the document. So the logic is here that this character is reading silently, that they're reading, taking in the document, and then indicating what is in that document. This wouldn't make any sense if people did not regularly read silently. The audience wouldn't be able to sort of understand what is this person doing, looking at a text, not reading it aloud, if they did not know that silent reading was a normal action in the ancient world. Number 4 here, in the Greek novel Leucippe and Cleitophon, the male protagonist, whose name is Cleitophon, who the title of the book is in part from his name, he pretends to read silently as he walks around a house so that he can look at, sort of creep on, stalk on the female protagonist Leucippe, who he has recently fallen in love with. So if Cleitophon is walking around reading aloud, his cover is going to be completely blown. Rather, he's pretending to read silently and sort of looking up from his text to sneak peeks at his newfound love. The fifth one here, we have Dionysius in another letter, in Kairos and Kalorhoe, reading a letter that causes him to faint. So he receives this letter in the middle of a banquet with a whole bunch of people around, and he looks at it, and the contents of it are so shocking to him that he just passes out, and he passes out after reading silently. And we know this because he doesn't sort of indicate to the rest of the people present what is the content of the letter. He wants to keep that secret. So as he passes out, he holds on to the letter so that no one else can know what the content of it is. So 5 more accounts of people reading silently very explicitly from the Greco-Roman context. We have the Jewish author Josephus, in a way similar to Dionysius, taking in a letter. He receives a letter and quickly looks at it to figure out what's in there. So he glances over it, reads it silently to himself to know what is inside the letter. Suetonius tells us that Nero, when he was overseeing court cases, he would read silently and in private, very explicitly using those words, silent reading. So he would read the advisor's opinion silently in private before saying what his decision on the case was. We have Plutarch saying that Cato, at the sort of height of the Catiline controversy, being indignant that Caesar read a note silently to himself. So he thinks the note has something to do with the conspiracy, but it turns out that actually it's just sort of a sultry love note from Caesar's lover. Number 9, Philo, the Jewish philosopher, regularly portrays reading as an affair of the eyes. So he'll say, you read with your eyes. He'll talk about taking in the text with your eyes, not with your ears. So there's sort of a close correlation between seeing the text for Philo and reading it. Just as for us, sort of when we read silently and in private, we think of it as an ocular affair, one that we do with our eyes, not an audio affair, unless, of course, we're doing something like listening to an audiobook. And the final text of reading silently in Greco-Roman antiquity, we have Pliny the Younger drawing a distinction between the auditory and visual appreciation of the text. So Pliny says you can appreciate a text both in the hearing of it, but also in the visual aspect of it. When you look at a papyrus document, you can sort of appreciate the beauty of the writing itself. So once again, like Philo, Pliny is associating reading with the eyes, but also with the ears, because reading is a multimedia affair in both the ancient context and also in our own modern context. So the short of it is that literate persons did read silently in antiquity. I didn't go through cases where people are reading aloud. You can find many of those in the book, and you can find them happening in different kinds of settings. But the short of it is that there were different mechanics, multiple different mechanics for reading in the ancient world, both silently and also aloud. Connected to the myth that reading was always allowed is the myth that reading was usually a communal act in antiquity, that it wasn't an individualized kind of thing, that when you read a text, and especially some kind of literary discourse, when you read literature, you were doing it in a group setting. But as we have seen, even with our cases of silent reading, our receipts for silent reading in the ancient world, we saw that there are many cases where that silent reading happens in a solitary environment. What I'm going to do here is give us 10 more receipts for solitary reading in antiquity. Some of these might be reading silently, and some of them might be reading aloud. We have 2 members of the Greco-Roman literati, Cato and Seneca, both indicating that they read and studied alone, and also other persons indicating that these 2 individuals read and studied alone. Number 2, the satirist Martial will frequently put jokes into his epigrams, which are sort of like short, pithy sayings. And those jokes are meant to be experienced between the reader and Martial himself. So he'll say things like, you keep looking at this document even though you know you shouldn't be doing this right now. So it's meant to be a sort of one-to-one sort of thing, indicating that reading is a solitary act, for these jokes to work for Martial. Number 3, we have Severus reading Martial's poetry to himself, reading the epigrams to himself while he's at parties or while he's at the theater, because he thought that this was more entertaining than whatever was happening at the theater. That Martial, sort of in a bombastic and self-aggrandizing sort of way, says, hey, even at these lavish events, my epigrams are going to be read because they're more interesting than what's going on at those particular events. Whether or not that's actually true is less important than the fact that Marshall can imagine someone reading in a solitary setting or reading to themselves while in a context of community, while other people are about. Number 4 here, we've got Pliny the Younger going on and making extracts and reading while the volcano Vesuvius is erupting. So Pliny's life is in danger. He can see this smoke cloud, this plume cloud from the volcano. A very, very famous account of Vesuvius erupting. But Pliny says, I was so committed to reading that I just kept on reading. And he was reading to himself in a solitary context. Number 5, we have Aristotle asking the question, which may be a very familiar question to you, a very familiar experience to you, why some people get sleepy when they read, but other people are sort of enlivened. They wake up more, they become more alive while they are reading. And so sleepiness doesn't happen when one is reading publicly in a communal context. The sort of mind slows down in the act of private solitary reading, and that's the thing that made people sleepy while they read, both in the ancient world and also in the modern world. Moving on to our next 5 here, we have Augustine again writing about reading a page of text, forgetting what he's read and having to reread it again. Again, a familiar experience for you. And we wouldn't expect in a communal or a public reading setting where you're reading to other people that you would forget what you read and go back and read it again to everybody, that's a very sort of individual, solitary kind of thing. Number 7, we have Philo once again. He's reflecting on this commandment in Deuteronomy chapter 17 that the Jewish king is supposed to write out Torah in their own hand. But Philo also says, in addition to this, the king should also read this self-made copy to himself daily, sort of as a reminder that, hey, I wrote this Torah out in my own hand, and to be reminded not only of the content of it, but how important it is that it would be written out in one's own hand. So again, this is sort of a daily, individual, solitary, ritualistic activity that Philo has in mind for the king. Josephus relays an account of something like this actually happening. That Eleazar finds the Parthian king Azayates, who converts to Judaism, eventually has himself circumcised and attempts to become a Jew himself, reading the law of Moses to himself. So he's reading in a solitary setting on his own to himself. Number 9, we have early Christian evidence, Justin Martyr and Tertullian, assuming that people who are antagonistic to Christianity, sort of those anti-Christians, as it were, they suggest that these people can examine Christian scriptures on their own, that they have access to the text, they can look at the text on their own and decide for themselves the merits of Christianity. And Tatian, another early Christian, seems to indicate that sort of this kind of thing is actually how he became a Christian, that his conversion to Christianity happened by a chance encounter of Scripture. He sort of happened to come upon Scripture and, having read it to himself, decided to convert to Christianity. And the last one here, we have once again some early Christians. Clement, the apostolic tradition, Origen, and John Chrysostom all give counsel that Christians should read scriptures personally and on their own before meals and at home. In some of these cases, this is in preparation for sort of a church reading, a church gathering, wherein the same scripture will be read, so that you have 2 different reading events, an individual solitary reading event of scripture at one time, and then a communal reading of that same scripture at a later time. So again, all of these 10 receipts indicating that solitary reading was a known thing in a variety of different contexts for the Greco-Roman literati, for the Jewish literati, and for early Christians. And so what I suggest is that there were multiple different kinds of reading in Greco-Roman antiquity, just as there are multiple different kinds and modes of reading today. And what I want to do is give us some important term to sort of help us categorize or plot these different kinds of reading modes and events in the Greco-Roman world. So I plot them on the level of the number of persons present, from individual reading, where it is just one person reading a text, to communal reading, which can extend to any number of people. I think it's important to engage and be sort of precise about what we mean when we're talking about different group sizes. So I say that a small group is between 2 and 10 people, a medium or moderately sized group is 10 to 49 people, and a large group reading event is 50 or more people. My sense is that in the Greco-Roman context, individual reading and small group reading are the most common ways of reading, whereas moderately sized group reading and large group reading are more rare than individual reading and small group reading. So these individual and communal reading refers to the number of people present at a reading, whereas private reading and public reading refer to the sort of sociality of the reading event. So a private reading is a reading in which not everyone can be there. It is by its nature socially private. It could be happening in a home, happening in a place where not anyone can walk in on it at any time. Public reading, in contrast, is in a public space. And we'll often see that public reading and communal reading kind of get conflated with one another in early Christian and New Testament scholarship. But I think these are different kinds of things. Public reading is a reading event in which someone could be present at the event without sort of social barriers to it. So it's happening in a space that is open and available to just about anyone. And so to plot these onto two different axes, we have private and public reading on our y-axis here, and then individual and communal reading on an x-axis here to indicate the different kinds of reading events that are private to public in nature, or the space in which they occur, and engage a number of different people. So I have given examples of lots of different things here. We're going to start in our bottom left quadrant. An individual private reading would be something like, and I put this on the left of the axis altogether, insofar as no one is reading this text, an unread text that exists or is stored in a private space. So the text is there, but it's unread. Similarly, a publicly unread text is some kind of posted writing or a posted notice or a graffiti that is never read. And then down over here, we have different modes of reading: reading to an individual aloud, reading to oneself silently. We could have a reader or a lector, usually an enslaved person, reading to a master or a small group. So depending on how large the group is, it would be plotted differently. We have examples of family reading, of family engaging a text together, one family member reading it aloud. Similarly, it may not be a family group, but some kind of small group, whether it be invited friends or for entertainment. And then again, as the size of the group changes, it goes to a different place on our axis here. When we move over to these sort of more public spaces, so these are all happening in spaces that are not available to anyone. We might up here have a person reading to oneself silently in a public space, or any number of groups of varying sizes reading to one another, or one person reading to the group in a public space that someone might come upon. And then furthest up here, we have the reading to a gathered mass, where an individual text is read to a group of 50 or more people. And normally these are sort of really large, exceptional events. And so they are far more rare than the events that are going to happen down here closer to the center of our axis. So all of this to say, the big takeaway here is that there were a bunch of different ways to read in Greco-Roman antiquity, both silently and aloud, and both in private and communal spaces. There is not one mode of reading in the ancient world, just as there is not one mode or setting of reading in the modern world.